Hello everyone, and welcome to World War II at 80. I'm Ron May, your host, author, historian, and speaker on World War II history and the stories of those who served. We continue with our 13th episode today, which focuses on the events and stories of January 1945. The first month of 1945 brought an extension of the hardships of December 1944. On the Belgian-German border of the Ardennes Forest, the Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16th, raged on. The good news was that by January, the American forces had stopped the German advance into Belgium and began steadily pushing the Nazi army back toward Germany. The bad news was that it all came at a great cost. Several men from Morgan County, Indiana, made noteworthy contributions. Some of them lost their lives in the effort. Army medic Albert Bert Baughn served bravely on the Bulge battlefront, tending to the wounded. Wounded himself on December 17th, the second day of the Battle of the Bulge, he was evacuated to a field hospital. Knowing his unit was in a critical battle with the Germans, he pleaded with the Army doctors to release him so that he could return to the front and care for the injured. He got his way and made it back to his unit the next day. A few weeks later, on January 8th, despite the bold red cross worn on Baughn's armband and helmet, a German sniper placed him in his crosshairs and fired, killing him instantly. The 19-year-old had been in Europe for less than a year, but he had made a significant contribution, treating and saving many comrades on the battlefield. Another Morgan County man kept busy in the sky over Belgium. James Barrick was a C-47 pilot assigned to the 72nd Troop Carrier Squadron, the 434th Troop Carrier Group, which came to the aid of the men on the ground in Belgium. Barrick, who had earlier dropped paratroopers into Normandy on D-Day, came to the aid of 1st Army units, including the 101st Airborne Division trapped in Bastogne, Belgium, with German forces surrounding them. The only hope for the outnumbered Allies to hold out was being resupplied from the sky. And it was from the sky where Barrick and the other transport pilots helped save the day. In what Army Air Force leaders later described as the largest and greatest supply mission in the European theater, over 800 C-47s flew resupply missions for 4 days in a row, often in adverse weather. Bundles attached to parachutes floated down to the American ground forces, containing life-saving medicine, food, and ammunition. Receiving that precious assistance on the ground were men like Gilpin Hammock of Martinsville, Indiana. Hammock, a staff sergeant, served with the 398th Infantry Regiment of the 100th Division. During the Battle of the Bulge, he was shot in the lower body, but survived. And for the rest of his life, Hammock, a Purple Heart recipient with 2 battlefield promotions, carried the German bullet that had lodged inside of him. As the Battle of the Bulge was wrapping up, another battle that had formed into a bulge was heating up 206 miles southeast of Bastogne, in the northeastern part of France, near the town of Colmar, indicated with the red circle at the bottom of the map. Colmar is in the Alsace region, at the base of the Vosges Mountains. The region had formerly been a part of France, but when the Germans invaded France in 1940, they made Alsace, shown with the green arrow on the dark yellow area, part of Germany. By November 1944, German forces were desperately trying to defend the 800 square mile area around Colmar from the U.S. 6th Army Group's advancement. That advancement had surrounded the German troops and produced a pocket where Germans continued to resist. Hence, the conflict became known as the Battle of the Colmar Pocket. It was on this battle-scarred ground that a U.S. infantryman from the 6th Army Group became the most highly decorated soldier in World War II. His name was Audie Murphy, a 19-year-old first lieutenant from Texas who would go on to become a movie star in a 21-year acting career. Murphy was in the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. On January 26, 1945, Murphy, who had been made acting commander of B Company, was engaged by German troops that outnumbered his unit. The Germans struck one of the company's M10 tank destroyers, setting it on fire and causing the crew to abandon it. Murphy called for his company to withdraw to defensive positions, as they were overwhelmed by advancing tanks and infantry. Murphy, however, did not withdraw from the location. He remained alone on the line and fired at the advancing enemy with his M1 carbine while using his radio to call in for artillery support. After emptying his carbine, he jumped on the burning M10 tank destroyer that had been hit by the Germans and began firing the destroyer's .50 caliber machine gun at the advancing Germans. Even after being shot in the leg, he continued firing the weapon and holding off the enemy's advance, killing or injuring 50 Germans. Once the machine gun had emptied, he returned to his company and then led them back to the line to repel the Germans. For his brave and sacrificial action in that battle, he was awarded the military's highest honor, the Medal of Honor, which he received later in June after Germany surrendered. His was a tale of being wounded, but still winning, and it became a fitting moniker for the events in Europe in January 1945. Murphy died in a tragic plane crash in the mountains of Virginia on May 28, 1971. He was 45 years old. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. The Holtzwer Memorial to Audie Murphy stands today several miles northeast of the town of Colmar, near where his action of being on the tank and firing at the Germans took place. An information board at the memorial tells the story of his heroics in holding off the Germans. By February 6th, the U.S. Army had overrun the Germans and secured the Colmar pocket. Pacific Theater forces were in the thick of their own combat operations in January 1945 on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. Because of its strategic position in the Pacific, U.S. leaders wanted to protect the islands at all cost. In the months leading up to U.S. involvement in World War II, some 135,000 troops and 227 aircraft were stationed on the island. But they were no match for the superior Japanese forces that outnumbered the joint Allied forces. Japan's army invaded Luzon on December 8, 1941, taking control of the island 4 months later. Almost 4 years later, on January 9, 1945, 175,000 members of the U.S. 6th Army Group landed along a 20-mile beachhead at Lingayen Gulf, near the city of Baguio on the west-central edge of Luzon. Martinsville, Indiana native Adrian Stanger was part of the landing at Luzon. "The Japs bombed us our whole way in," Stanger recalled. 2 or 3 in our company were killed and others were injured. Once established on land, Stanger took to his truck, hauling his squad to different points on the island as they closed in on the Japanese occupiers. William Gabinet of Clinton, Indiana, was also part of the landing forces. He was with the 185th Infantry Regiment, part of the Army's 40th Division. In his memoir, he wrote, "After landing on Luzon on D-Day +1, our ships were immediately firing on Japanese planes. One kamikaze plane landed on the top deck of one ship and exploded. I saw another go down in flames, but while walking up a road with Ray Hartman, a boy from Iowa, I suddenly found a plane spitting lead and aiming for little old me and Ray. I quickly dove into a pig pen. How nice to have one so close at hand, with Ray right behind and beside me. We both looked at each other, happy to be alive after our first encounter with real danger and death. Within the next few days, about 175,000 men followed across the 20-mile beachhead at Luzon. With heavy air support, Army units pushed inland across the Zambales Mountains, shown in the green arrow, toward Clark Field, 40 miles west of Manila, last week of January. William Gabinet wrote about his unit's experience getting across the Zambales Mountains. Day after day we plodded forward toward the Zambales Mountains. The nights were just as bad as the days, as we bivouacked in open areas and formed perimeters for our protection against night banzai attacks by the Japanese. Gabinet also wrote of a particularly horrifying incident where they lost a lot of men, 85 of the 160. The Japanese mounted a moonlight attack on his company, where their silhouetted figures were so obvious. The result was disastrous and fatal for some of the men. They encountered small arms fire, and mortar shells were landing all around them. Lying flat on the ground, they prayed for the order to withdraw. The men were ordered to recapture Clark Airfield, where Japanese forces had destroyed the U.S. planes 4 years earlier. Upon reaching Clark Field, Gabinet and his unit saw the charred planes and burned and black-looking corpses that were strewn all around. There were mines of 100 to 550-pound aerial bombs, otherwise known as blockbusters, that were buried fuse up and ready to blow someone to kingdom come. Gabinet wrote, "Despite throwing everything at them, air and artillery bombardment, self-propelled guns, hand grenades, demolitions, and flamethrowers, some 3,000 Japanese had to be dislodged from their positions." This was a taxing and dangerous job, one of the most hair-raising experiences for a first or second scout, positions that put him on the point and in the spot of being the first one shot at and possibly killed. I was that first or second scout at different times. The battle against Japanese forces on Luzon was fierce. Although it did not produce the highest number of American casualties, it did reach the highest net total of casualties for any battle during World War II. It is estimated that some 200,000 Japanese soldiers died during the battle, most of them victims of disease and starvation. On the Allied side, over 8,000 Americans died, and over 150,000 Filipinos, most of whom were civilians massacred by the Japanese, lost their lives. By March 1945, after 3 months of fierce combat, most of Luzon came under Allied control. There remained, however, pockets of Japanese infantry that hid in the mountains and resisted until Japan surrendered in August 1945. One key objective on Luzon was the Bataan Peninsula, located across the bay from Manila. This was the location of the bitter holdout of General MacArthur's army back in early 1942, after Japan invaded Luzon in early December of 1941. Outmanned and never resupplied, the brave American forces held out against the enemy invaders for several months. But the Japanese forces eventually surrounded the American Filipino forces and overwhelmed them. By April 1942, surrender was the only reasonable option. The Americans, numbering around 75,000 with Filipinos, were marched 70 miles north to a POW camp. Because of all the men who died on the 3-day march due to months of starvation and disease, an estimated 18,000 Filipinos and over 500 Americans, it became known as the Bataan Death March. The captured men were forced to walk over 60 miles north to Camp O'Donnell, which became a prisoner of war camp. While Bataan was under siege by American forces in late January 1945, a group of 100 men from the 6th Army Rangers and 200 Filipino guerrillas pulled off a daring surprise raid at Cabanatuan prisoner of war camp in the northern part of Bataan, where approximately 500 U.S. POWs were imprisoned. Among them was Paragon, Indiana native James Duckworth. Colonel Duckworth had been sent to the Philippines in September 1940 on a 2-year assignment as the commanding officer of General Hospital No. 1 in Manila. After the Japanese invasion, Duckworth kept busy as commanding medical officer of Bataan while the Japanese forces closed in on them in early 1942. He oversaw the steady stream of wounded men needing medical care. Following the Bataan Death March, Duckworth found himself as the lead medical officer at Cabanatuan POW camp. He and the other captured U.S. doctors did their best to treat the wounded and sick prisoners, but they had limited means. Thousands died over the ensuing years of imprisonment due to disease, starvation, and other ailments. By January 1945, only 500 surviving POWs were left at Cabanatuan camp. Sweet freedom came unexpectedly on January 30th, when the Army 6th Rangers pulled off their daring raid and freed the men. They were brought back to the safety of U.S. lines and treated. Colonel Duckworth was among the survivors of the 3-year imprisonment, and he made it home. But he died 6 months later, on November 11, 1945, of a heart attack. He was 54. He lived long enough, however, to enjoy the victory over the nation that had imprisoned him and others for 3 years. Another noteworthy event occurred on the last day of January, when a 1,072-mile road from India to China opened as the Ledo Road, later named the Stilwell Road, honoring General Joseph Stilwell. Japanese forces had closed the former Burma Road in 1942 to prevent Allied supplies from reaching China to aid in their combat with Japan. The new road, which had been under construction since December 1942, provided an essential linkage from British India to Nationalist China for running supplies to the Nationalist Army in China as they continued their fight against the Japanese. Greenwood, Indiana native William McColgan of the 85th Quartermaster Company was part of the effort to build the Ledo Road back in late 1942 and early 1943. He was stationed near Assam on the northeast corner of India and Burma. His unit stayed in bamboo huts right off the road while Bill oversaw the overhaul maintenance of Army trucks used in the Ledo Road's construction. Japanese planes flew over the area every day, but the road's construction went on. During the month of January, the Allied advance toward mainland Japan, shown with the yellow arrows at left, continued and only grew stronger as 1945 began. Learn more about World War II history during 1944 and the stories of those who served in my World War II trilogy, Our Service, Our Stories, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. The books are available for purchase on my website, ronaldpmay.com. To contact me for questions or to schedule me for a speaking engagement, email me at ron@ronaldpmay.com. Also, be sure to check out all my other videos on my YouTube channel at World War II History and Stories with Ron May. You will find a link to my videos on the YouTube tab from the homepage of my website. Please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Thanks for tuning into this episode. Please share it with others who you think may be interested. See you next month for our episode 14, featuring the events and stories of February 1945 on World War II at 80.